Hello, tiny philosophical subcommunity. Today's question is, it's come from several people actually, about the controversy that Yuval Noah Harari got into on Twitter when he said, let's have a look, from a biological perspective, nothing is unnatural. Whatever is possible is by definition also natural. A truly unnatural behavior, one that goes against the laws of nature, simply can't exist, and so would need no prohibition. This is a fascinating topic. What is human nature? And can we say that things that humans do that we don't like them to do, or that are terrible things to do, go against human nature? Or do they express human nature as much as good things we do? What's the truth here? We're going to quickly get to the bottom of this, but let's look at a few responses together. First of all, we've got Jordan Peterson. So, say serial, terrible, horrible behavior toward children is natural because it's possible, so it doesn't go against the laws of nature, and therefore requires no prohibition. I hope I'm missing something here. Ooh. I don't believe you're missing something, Jordan. I believe you are semi-consciously evading the tweet that you're responding to in substance. So one thing, it seems to me, what Jordan is doing here is making a anti-postmodernist culture war gambit. He is making a culturally conservative gambit that says there's got to be such a thing as unconditional prohibitions, that there may be a kind of theological, if not a metaphysical story behind that. And that increasingly drifts him a million miles away from what Harari is saying. And Harari indeed doesn't say anything about things needing or not needing to be prohibited. He said if you wanted to prohibit an unnatural human behavior, you couldn't, because in his opinion, we'll analyze that in a second, nothing humans do is unnatural. God's sad. Good thinking, Yuval. The universal taboo against incest is clearly wrong-headed. I'm not even going to read that because that makes the same mistake that Jordan is making. Jonathan Pagao. It results from his own logic that from a biological perspective, prohibitions are also natural. So what is even the subject of this tweet? Well, the subject wouldn't be anything if it were prohibitions, but that's not the subject. The subject is rather how much can we leverage the idea of human nature when we talk about how we understand what we do and what we should and what we shouldn't do. So out goes Jonathan. Alan's response here, Alan Levinovitz, is a very good person on Twitter and a fine academic. He says, I disagree. I argue in my book that it makes sense to distinguish a spectrum of naturalness where the causal force of human will is correlated with less natural. That is how we use the terms nature and natural in everyday language. That has nothing to do with what Harari is talking about. Harari is talking about potatoes, and Alan is talking about the price of turnips. Harari is talking about whether human nature, whatever human nature is compatible with a scenario in which we say that certain things that happen go against it. And then members of the general public just express moral outrage of various kinds. Okay. Now, I sometimes tell you when we talk that I strongly recommend you starting with a certain presumption because 99% of experts share it. This is not one of those talks. So don't feel you need to share my conclusion here. See it as rather a kind of very simple-minded philosophical exercise where I go onto the stage, I do a small sort of, touch my nose with my finger, and that's the end of the performance. But it's meant to offer you something, but that something isn't that you've got to share the conclusion. You can get whatever you need to get out of this. Now, let me make a sociological point. I didn't think I'd need to, but there we go. These responses are appalling. they are appalling for their willful negation of free thought. That's to say, they're not mistakes. They are partly deliberate enterprises at the obstruction of free thought, one's own and that of others. So many people in our public eye who are supposed to help us think are manipulating us to get better at not thinking for ourselves. Now, if you see them as just intellectual entertainers, then that's not something you even need to forgive, it's just okay. If you see them as genuine moral authorities in the sense that they carry a kind of professional duty as a public intellectual, well, then it's obviously a problem. Let's start with something very, very basic. Human nature is a radically underdetermined concept, whatever else we think about it. That's to say that you are a bit of physiology, a bit of neurophysiology that comes with a psychology, and that psychology reveals various powers, various propensities, various capabilities, but they need to be expressed under culture in very different ways, and how they get expressed is underdetermined. So a feature of human nature, if you like, is that human beings live under culture, and what happens under culture is underdetermined by any universal account of human nature. It's compatible with it, but underdetermined by it. So it's very important that there is a universal human psychology, but it gets expressed in many different ways under many different circumstances. It's an absolutely central thing to understand about human nature. Now, Yuval's point. Could it be that there are certain cultural practices that go against human nature? No. So once something happens, it can't go against human nature. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been possible for it to happen. And that is roughly what Harari is saying. And as far as I'm concerned, that must be true. Nothing that we can get up to can go against human nature, because if it went against human nature, it wouldn't happen. It would be impossible. Now, obviously, we're not saying anything except what we're saying here, right? And that's that you can't leverage the concept of human nature to say that different things we're doing are bad. But it certainly doesn't mean you can't leverage other concepts to say that these things are bad. Now, what if you were to disagree with me? Where would I recommend you to start in the history of the West? I think I'd recommend you to start with Aristotle. Because insofar as the Aristotelian project is coherent for us, it would lead you to say maybe Vlad is wrong, and we can talk about this business of human nature in a more hermeneutically rich way than Vlad allows. So let me just not flatten that in any way for you, but just make a personal point about my relationship with Aristotle. And it's a unique relationship because I have nothing like that relationship, like that kind of relationship with any human being, dead or alive. And that's that I, to an extraordinary extent, approve of so many things Aristotle leaves for us as resources for imagination and reflection, that it's really quite unbelievable how much that's the case, given that I fundamentally reject Aristotle's project. So for somebody who fundamentally rejects Aristotle's project, I can sound so sympathetic to Aristotle that I could be deemed an Aristotelian outside of a deeper context of how I think. So that ambivalent statement is where I'm going to leave it, except to say that these responses on Twitter were genuinely terrifying, right? And raise the question of whether we have become worse at thinking for ourselves. And to learn more about that, watch this video next.